My son snuck into the principal's house and wrecked the place, and instead of scolding him, I actually gave him a high five. A few weeks later, the phone rang. It was Officer Pete from the local police department, and that call completely turned my world upside down. My heart absolutely shattered the moment those chilling words left the officer's mouth. "We have your son in custody." I swear my world tilted right off its axis, because my son, my sweet Tommy, had just been accused of something so unthinkable, so impossibly dark. It felt like a sick joke. A joke that would soon expose a horrifying truth about our town. "Tommy? What happened? Is he hurt?" My hands were already shaking, reaching for my keys before he could even finish. "He broke into Principal Clancy's home tonight. Caused significant property damage. You need to come immediately." No, that was impossible. Not Tommy. My Tommy, who has high-functioning autism, who spends his days meticulously memorizing every dinosaur name imaginable, who lives by routine and order. A burglar? The thought was absurd. But then the officer's voice was firm, almost impatient. "Sir, we have him on security footage. Please come now." I ran to Tommy's room, my breath catching in my throat. His bed was empty. The window, usually locked tight, was cracked open, and there on the floor, muddy sneakers sat on the spot he always kept spotless. A cold dread seeped into my bones. My son, my incredible, unique boy, had truly gone missing and somehow was now apparently a criminal. At the station, before I even saw him, Principal Clancy's voice, thick with rage, assaulted my ears. $15,000. That disturbed little. That psychopath destroyed $15,000 of my property. My blood ran cold at his words, especially when I saw Tommy through the interview room glass. He sat there, perfectly still, hands folded, his lips moving silently in that counting pattern he did when he was completely overwhelmed, trying to make sense of a chaotic world. Officer Pete appeared at my elbow, his face grim. "Mr. Finch, we need to discuss your son's concerning behavior." He showed me printed screenshots. Tommy, methodically sorting items before smashing them, taking photos of documents, spray painting numbers on walls. No emotion. None. Has Tommy ever displayed violent tendencies? Any diagnosis we should know about? My throat tightened. "He's autistic, high-functioning, but he's never." "That explains the behavior patterns," the officer muttered, more to himself than to me. "We've called in a specialist. This level of calculated destruction, the lack of remorse." Before he could finish, Clancy stormed over, his round face purple with fury. "I want him prosecuted as an adult. That psychopath went through my personal files. He's probably selling information too. He's 12. I snapped, my own voice shaking with anger and fear. "And he is not a psychopath." Clancy sneered, his eyes narrowed. "Could have fooled me. Kid's always been off. Those dead eyes. The way he watches people. Now we know what he really is." Every word felt like a punch to my gut. Just then Detective Kit, a tired-looking woman with a surprisingly warm smile, led us all into a small conference room. Photos of the damage were spread across the table. Clancy's home office, completely ransacked. But something felt off. Only that room was touched. And on the walls, painted in precise, bold numbers, 350 Hernandez, 500 Mayan. Gang signs. Clancy blurted, clearly flustered. "The boy's obviously involved in." But Tommy laughed. A short, humorless sound. "I'm 12. I can't even remember how to tie my laces." "Tommy." I sat beside him, my hand gently on his shoulder. He didn't flinch, but he didn't lean in either. "Son, why? Help me understand." He finally looked at me, those dark eyes that never quite connected the way other kids did. "Javier's leaving." "What? Tonight?" "His whole family. They're driving to Mexico and not coming back." I was so confused. What did Javier have to do with any of this? Detective Kit leaned forward. "Tommy, what do those numbers mean?" Tommy pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen, a blur of motion. "Sent," he said simply. Suddenly, Detective Kit's phone buzzed. Then Officer Pete's. Then mine. "Those are the amounts of money that Principal Clancy blackmails undocumented families," Tommy explained in his flat, matter-of-fact voice, as if he were discussing the weather. "To not call ICE." The room exploded. Clancy jumped up, his face a mask of disbelief and pure panic. That's ridiculous. The boy's lying. He's delusional. But his voice cracked, sweat beaded on his forehead. Javier's mom cleans houses, Tommy continued, utterly unfazed by the chaos. 14 houses a week. She couldn't pay this month. Javier's sister needed surgery. So Clancy told her IC would come Monday. He started tapping his fingers, a nervous rhythm. Tomorrow is Monday. These are serious accusations, Detective Kit said slowly, but her eyes now were fixed on Clancy. The door burst open. Another officer rushed in, holding his phone. Detective, you need to see this. We just received an email. Photos, recordings, ledgers. 3 years of evidence. I stared at my son. This child who couldn't lie about brushing his teeth, who had to announce every feeling because he couldn't show them naturally. You've been collecting evidence? 247 days, Tommy confirmed. Since Aisha disappeared. She was from Bangladesh. Her dad fixed our car for free once. They couldn't pay either. Clancy was backing toward the door, muttering, I need my lawyer. This is harassment. The boy broke into my home. Sit down, Detective Kit commanded. She turned back to Tommy. Where are the original documents? Buried under the yellow swing at Ringsend Park, he replied, calm as ever. Everything's in waterproof containers with timestamps. Why didn't you tell someone? I asked, tears streaming down my face. The police. Tommy tilted his head. A gesture I knew meant he was truly perplexed. Officer Nikolai's nephew paid last year. Officer Williams knows too. His wife's cousin. I have receipts. The room went silent, thick with unspoken accusations. They're my friends, Tommy said suddenly, his voice cracking just barely. It was the first hint of real emotion I'd heard all night. Javier shares his fruit snacks. The red ones, even though they're his favorite. His mom makes tamales for my birthday because she knows I don't like cake. He paused. Friends help friends. Even if everyone thinks you're bad. Even if you have to break things. And just like that, the world shifted. My son wasn't a criminal. He was a hero. Principal Clancy was arrested on the spot, and those 2 officers, Nikolai and Williams, were detained within 24 hours. But what I didn't anticipate, what absolutely terrified me, was them pulling strings and being let out after just 3 days in a cell. Because for the entirety of their brief stay, there was just one thing on their minds, revenge. Revenge on me and on my son. The moment I heard they were out, a primal fear gripped me. I ran to every window in our house, yanking curtains closed so hard the rods bent. My hands shook as I twisted each lock twice, then checked them again, convinced I could hear them outside. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, completely oblivious, sorting his dinosaur cards into neat rows, focused on putting them in order by when they lived. He had no idea that Clancy, Nikolai, and Williams, men filled with hatred, were now walking free. I grabbed a dining room chair and wedged it under the back door handle. Then I pushed our heaviest bookcase in front of the basement door. Tommy looked up, confused. Why are you moving furniture? He asked. I told him we were just being extra safe for a while. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to arranging his triceratops next to his stegosaurus, explaining they both had similar plates and spikes. That night sleep was impossible. Every car that drove past made me jump, peering through the curtains like a hunted animal. A branch scraped against the window around midnight, and I nearly called 911. By 3 a.m. I couldn't take it anymore. I crept into Tommy's room, pushing his bed away from the window. The metal frame scraped against the floor. A jarring sound in the silence, but Tommy didn't stir. I dragged his heavy dresser over, shoving it against the window, blocking any way someone could get in. He woke up confused, his room looking all wrong, but accepted my explanation that I was fixing something. While he drifted back to sleep, I sat in his desk chair watching the door, a silent guardian. The next morning Detective Kit called, her voice tired and laced with worry. She confirmed what I already knew. They'd made bail. The department was monitoring the situation, she said, but admitted they didn't have many resources, especially with 2 of their own officers involved. What are we supposed to do? I asked, my voice thin. Document everything suspicious. Call if you see any of them near you. I hung up and immediately called my boss, claiming a family emergency. He wasn't happy, but I didn't care. My family was the emergency. I drove to the hardware store and bought new deadbolts, a basic security system I absolutely couldn't afford, and motion sensor lights. Tommy came with me, and in the car he read every instruction manual aloud in his flat, precise voice. Hearing him calmly explain optimal sensor placement and battery backup systems somehow made everything feel a little less terrifying. We spent all day installing it, Tommy holding screws and reading directions while I drilled and wired. The alarm system kept beeping errors until Tommy, with his unique logic, figured out I'd connected 2 wires wrong. By Thursday, the whispers had started at school. Tommy came home confused, asking why 3 different kids called him a snitch at recess. One boy said his dad told him Tommy was a rat who got good people in trouble. Another claimed Tommy broke into someone's house like a criminal. Tommy just didn't understand why being honest about what Clancy did made him bad. I tried to explain, but he kept asking logical questions I couldn't answer, questions about right and wrong that, for him, always came back to facts. Friday morning, the school counselor called. Tommy was placed on home instruction, pending the investigation. She kept saying it was for his safety, but I knew better. They just wanted him gone until this mess blew over. Parents had been calling, complaining about a dangerous child in class with their kids. Tommy, bless his heart, was actually happy about it. He hated the noise in the cafeteria anyway. Then Saturday afternoon, a knock on the door. Through the peephole, I saw a woman with a clipboard and an official badge. CPS. An anonymous tip about child endangerment and neglect. My stomach dropped. She had to come in and inspect our home. Protocol. Tommy started rocking in his chair the moment she walked in, completely overwhelmed by this stranger in our sacred space. She peered into our fridge, checked Tommy's room, asked about his medications and therapy. She looked skeptical, especially when she saw how meticulously clean and organized everything was. Tommy had even labeled all his belongings with his label maker. She took photos and notes while Tommy rocked harder, humming the same 4 notes over and over. After she left, I started documenting everything. Exact time of the visit, every question, how long she stayed. Detective Kit had warned me. This was how retaliation usually started, using official channels as weapons. It made me wonder what Tommy had really been processing all this time. 247 days of watching and collecting evidence, while everyone else just saw a quiet kid sorting dinosaur cards. There's something so fascinating, so uniquely him, about how he connects friendship to action in such a logical way. Javier shares red fruit snacks, so Tommy commits a crime to save his family. I created a folder, tucking the CPS report inside along with notes about the school situation. I started a timeline on my laptop of everything that happened since Tommy broke into Clancy's house. Monday morning, I went to the courthouse to file for temporary restraining orders. The clerk's face changed the moment she saw I was filing against 2 police officers. Her hands hesitated over the keyboard. She kept asking if I was sure. She processed the paperwork, but I could tell she was deeply uncomfortable. Other people in the office kept looking over at us, their whispers like buzzing flies. That afternoon my phone rang. Unknown number. A woman named Sloane Egan. A journalist. She'd heard about the case. She wanted to do a story about what really happened. Part of me yearned for the protection public attention might bring. Another part worried it would make everything worse for Tommy, who was already struggling with the profound changes to his routine. I told her I needed to think about it and hung up. Detective Kit called me back within 10 minutes. Come to the station right away, she said, her voice urgent, for an important talk about the case. I grabbed my jacket, driving over, surprised to find her waiting in the parking lot instead of inside. She walked me to her personal car and we sat there while she explained. I needed to document absolutely everything from now on, but keep my mouth shut publicly. She pulled out a folder, showing me examples of other cases where parents had unknowingly sabotaged their kids' defense by talking to reporters or posting on social media. The criminal case against Clancy and the juvenile proceedings for Tommy were both active, and anything I said could mess things up for both sides. She handed me a notebook. Write down every single thing. Every call, every interaction. Dates and times. That evening it happened. Tommy completely lost it. His regular dinosaur documentary wasn't on because of breaking news coverage about some political scandal. The disruption to his routine, the mounting stress, it all became too much. He started hitting his head against the wall, making this awful sound I'd never heard before, like a wounded animal in pure distress. I grabbed him, holding him tight while he thrashed and screamed, trying to keep him from hurting himself. It took 2 full hours of me sitting on the floor with him, rocking back and forth, counting to 10 over and over in the pattern he liked, before he finally started to calm down. His whole body was shaking and sweaty, and in that moment I realized just how badly all this stress was affecting him, even though he couldn't tell me with words. Tuesday morning I woke up with a singular, desperate thought. We needed a real lawyer. Someone who understood kids like Tommy. I called around to 5 different offices, each one quoting prices that made my stomach hurt. But I couldn't afford not to have someone who knew what they were doing. The 6th call was to Deborah Innes. Her assistant said she could see me that afternoon if I could get downtown by 3. I left work early, telling my boss I had a family emergency, which for once wasn't a lie. Her office was small and cramped, squeezed between a bail bondsman and a check cashing place, but the walls were covered with thank you letters from families. She shook my hand firmly and listened patiently while I explained everything. Tommy, the break-in, the evidence, his autism, and how terrified I was that they'd treat him like a regular criminal. She took notes on a yellow legal pad, nodding, asking smart, specific questions about Tommy's diagnosis, his support needs, and what accommodations he had at school. She'd handled 3 other cases with autistic kids in the juvenile system, and she truly understood that Tommy's brain worked differently, that what looked like criminal behavior was really him trying to help his friends the only way he knew how. She pulled out a whiteboard and mapped out our options, explaining we could push for a diversion program that would keep Tommy completely out of the system if he did community service and went to therapy. She also warned me that Clancy would definitely file a civil suit for the property damage, and we needed to start preparing for that too. She gave me homework, a list of documents to gather and people to contact for character references. The TRO hearing got scheduled for next week, and I spent every night after Tommy went to bed organizing everything. I printed out every text message, made copies of the CPS report, documented the school suspension, created a meticulous timeline of every incident since the arrest. I bought a 3-ring binder and dividers, making sections for different types of evidence. My life had become an endless, desperate fight for my son. Wednesday night around 11 o'clock, my phone started going crazy with texts from numbers I didn't recognize. The messages were vile. Your kid's going to pay. Snitches get stitches. And worse things I don't even want to repeat. I screenshot every single one, forwarding them immediately to Deborah, just like she told me to. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone. The texts kept coming for an hour, getting more and more specific about what they wanted to do to Tommy. The terror was suffocating. Thursday morning I went outside to go to work and found my front tire completely flat, a huge gash in the sidewall. A clear message. I called the police, and Officer Pete showed up about 20 minutes later to take the report. While he was writing everything down, he quietly mentioned that Internal Affairs wanted to talk to me about Nikolai and Williams, handing me a business card for someone named Merrick Dunlap. He said Dunlap was one of the good ones, and I should call him today. I met Dunlap that afternoon in a borrowed office at the community center, not the police station, which he said was safer for both of us. He had gray hair and tired eyes, but seemed genuinely angry about what Nikolai and Williams had done. He took handwritten notes instead of using official forms, explaining he was working outside normal channels because he didn't know who else might be involved. He asked detailed questions about Tommy's evidence, especially the receipts showing the officers knew about the blackmail. He wanted exact dates, amounts, and any witnesses. Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang again. The same CPS worker from before stood there, looking embarrassed, holding another complaint form. This time, someone had reported educational neglect, since Tommy wasn't in school. I showed her all my documentation from the first visit, plus the letter from the school about home instruction, plus the emails with his teachers about assignments. She took photos of everything and said she was getting tired of these obviously false reports. She promised to note in her file that someone was using CPS as harassment, which might help us later. Saturday morning, Sloan Egan called while I was making Tommy's breakfast. The same exact meal he eats every day. 2 scrambled eggs with no salt and toast cut into triangles. She said she'd been thinking about the story angle, and wanted to shift the focus to the families who were blackmailed instead of Tommy, promising she'd keep us anonymous and only use the evidence Tommy collected to expose how the system failed these people. I wrote down everything she said in my notebook, while Tommy sorted his dinosaur cards at the table, arranging them by period, then by size within each period. The phone rang again an hour later. This time it was someone from the district attorney's office, saying they were sending over a new prosecutor from the county level, someone named Geraldine Falk who had no connections to our town. Finally, a glimmer of hope. The emergency school board meeting was set for that same afternoon, and I spent the morning gathering all Tommy's school records, his IEP documents, his therapy reports, everything that showed he was a good student who'd never been in trouble before this. The meeting room at the district office was packed when we arrived. Parents stood along the walls because all the seats were taken, and the moment we walked in, the room split into two groups. Some people moving away from us, others nodding in support. The board president banged his gavel over and over, trying to get order while parents shouted about Tommy being dangerous, and others yelled back that he was a hero for exposing corruption. Tommy covered his ears and started rocking in his chair, his lips moving in his counting pattern, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 1 0, over and over while the chaos got worse. The board voted to place Tommy on home instruction pending the investigation, which meant I'd have to figure out how to work from home and teach him at the same time. Another hurdle. Another adjustment. Sunday I spent setting up our dining room as a classroom, printing worksheets from his teacher's emails, and organizing supplies in the specific way Tommy needed them. Blue folders for math, green for science, red for English. Monday morning started with Tommy doing his assignments while I tried to handle work calls in the kitchen, constantly muting myself when he needed help with a problem. The doorbell rang at 10 a.m., and a process server handed me a thick envelope. Clancy's civil suit, demanding damages for property destruction, emotional distress, and defamation. The total? An impossible $50,000 we didn't have. Our homeowner's insurance company sent an email an hour later, saying they were reviewing whether this was covered under our policy, since it involved criminal activity. My heart sank. I called Deborah immediately, and she came over that afternoon with paperwork to file for Tommy's case to be handled in juvenile diversion court. If we could get him into that program, she explained, he'd avoid having a record. She said the hearing was set for 3 weeks away, which felt like forever, when every single day brought some new problem or threat. Tuesday, someone created a Facebook page called Justice for Principal Clancy that already had 200 members, posting vile lies about Tommy attacking other kids and me being a drunk who couldn't control him. Deborah told me not to respond, not to engage at all, because anything we said would just make it worse and give them more ammunition. It was hard resisting the urge to fight back. Wednesday morning, Merrick Dunlap called. He needed Tommy to walk him through exactly how he gathered all that evidence step by step so Internal Affairs could build their case against the corrupt officers. I was scared Tommy might say something that could hurt his own case, but Merrick promised he was only interested in the corruption, not in prosecuting Tommy for anything. We met at the community center again, and Tommy explained in his flat voice how he started recording conversations on his phone after Aisha's family disappeared, how he'd taken photos of documents when he delivered things to the principal's office for teachers, how he tracked the money by watching who went into Clancy's office looking scared and came out crying. Merrick took notes the whole time, occasionally asking Tommy to slow down or repeat something, and I could see him getting angrier with each detail about how long this had been happening. After the meeting, we stopped at the grocery store for milk and bread, then the pharmacy for Tommy's anxiety medication. And as I pulled out of the pharmacy parking lot, I noticed it. The same dark sedan that had been behind us at the grocery store. The car stayed 3 vehicles back but took every turn we did. When I deliberately drove past our street and circled the block, it followed. I called 911 while driving, explaining we were being followed, giving them the license plate number I could partially see in my mirror. The operator said they'd send a patrol car, but by the time I pulled into our driveway, the sedan was gone, and the officer who showed up 20 minutes later said, without proof of a threat, there wasn't much they could do. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was relentless. Thursday, Geraldine Falk finally called, introducing herself as the new prosecutor and asking if she could come by to discuss the evidence Tommy had collected. She arrived that afternoon in a simple gray suit, no fancy jewelry or expensive shoes like the local prosecutors always wore, and spent 2 hours going through everything with us. She said she was already reaching out to the families who'd been blackmailed, trying to get them to make statements, but most were too scared to come forward, even with Clancy arrested. Friday afternoon, she called back with some progress, saying the Guyan family had agreed to testify about the $500 they'd paid last year when their work permits were delayed. The Patels were thinking about it but were scared of deportation even though they had legal status now, and Falk was working to get them protection guarantees. Slowly, painfully, things were moving. Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. The CPS worker stood there with her clipboard, looking relieved, telling me they were closing the investigation since they found nothing wrong. But she warned me that if more false reports came in, they'd start looking at who was making them instead of just investigating us. Good. Monday, the insurance company called about scheduling a deposition for Clancy's property damage claim. Deborah spent the entire afternoon walking me through every possible question they might ask, showing me how to answer without giving them anything they could twist against us. She made me practice saying, "I don't recall," and "to the best of my knowledge," over and over until it felt natural, explaining how even innocent statements could become weapons in civil court. It was a brutal training session. Wednesday morning, we sat in a conference room downtown while Clancy's lawyer, a thin man with wire glasses who kept tapping his pen, grilled me for 3 hours about Tommy's diagnosis and whether he'd ever shown violent tendencies. Deborah objected to almost every question, but I could see what they were doing, trying to paint Tommy as some dangerous kid who needed to be locked up instead of a 12-year-old who exposed corruption. The lawyer kept asking about specific incidents at school, whether Tommy had meltdowns, whether he'd ever hit anyone, whether I'd sought psychiatric help for his behavioral issues. Each question felt like another knife twisting in my gut. That night after Tommy went to bed, I found it. A piece of paper shoved under our front door. Numbers, written in Tommy's exact counting pattern. The message: 1, 2, 3, you can't protect him. For 5, 6, we know his tricks. It was so specifically cruel, so personally targeted at mocking how my son's brain worked, that I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I called Detective Kid immediately, and she came over to collect the note as evidence, adding it to our growing file of harassment that we'd need for the restraining order hearing on Friday. The judge reviewed everything we'd documented: the text, the following incident, the note under the door. And finally, she granted temporary restraining orders against Clancy, Nikolai, and Williams, ordering them to stay at least 500 feet away from us, which meant they couldn't come near our house or Tommy's school. A small victory, a tiny breath of relief. Saturday afternoon, Sloan called me, her voice shaking. Someone had approached her after she'd interviewed one of the families about Clancy, telling her to drop the story about that kid. She'd managed to record the whole thing on her phone. She sent the recording to both the police and Geraldine Falk, who was building a stronger case with each piece of evidence showing witness intimidation. Monday morning, Merrick from Internal Affairs called with news that Officer Williams had been placed on administrative leave after they found problems with his reports from the past year. Cases where evidence went missing or witness statements got changed. He also mentioned that Nikolai had suddenly filed for retirement, effective immediately, which seemed like more than a coincidence given the timing. Things were finally starting to move in our favor, albeit slowly. Tuesday we needed groceries, so I took Tommy to the store early, hoping to avoid crowds. But near the cereal aisle, a man I recognized from the school board meeting started yelling about how Tommy had destroyed a good man's life and ruined the community. Tommy immediately covered his ears and started hitting himself in the head. That repetitive motion he does when completely overwhelmed. I had to pick him up and carry him out while at least 5 people filmed us with their phones. The videos were online within an hour, with comments calling Tommy a psycho and me a terrible parent. But Geraldine saw them too, and added more witness intimidation charges to Clancy's case. The judge wasn't happy about the grocery store incident and modified Clancy's bail conditions to include GPS monitoring and absolutely no contact with any witnesses, direct or indirect. Every attack they launched just made their own chains tighter. Wednesday night was the community forum about school safety. I went alone since Tommy couldn't handle crowds anymore. Most parents avoided me like I had some disease. But during the break, a woman I'd seen at pickup slipped me a folded note. Her family had paid Clancy $800 last year when their visa renewal was delayed. She was too scared to come forward, but wanted me to know we weren't alone. Two other parents made eye contact and nodded slightly. And one dad whispered, "Thank you," as he passed, making me realize how many families had been suffering in silence, and how much bravery Tommy's actions had sparked. Thursday morning, Deborah called to say the insurance company was pushing for a quick settlement, offering to pay Clancy's full claim if we agreed not to countersue for harassment or defamation. She advised against taking it since we had strong grounds for our own civil case once the criminal charges were resolved. But the thought of this dragging on for months or years made my chest tight. I spent the afternoon organizing all our evidence into labeled folders while Tommy sat at the kitchen table doing his homework, occasionally asking me questions about fractions in his flat voice that somehow sounded more distant than before all this started. It was like a part of him had retreated behind a wall. Friday morning, my phone rang while I was making Tommy's breakfast. When I saw my boss's name on the screen, my stomach dropped. He never called this early. He started talking fast about getting multiple complaints from concerned citizens about me harboring a dangerous child, and how the company had to protect its reputation. So they were putting me on unpaid leave while they investigated the situation. I tried explaining that Tommy wasn't dangerous, but he cut me off, saying it was temporary, and hung up before I could even ask how long temporary meant. Tommy looked up from his cereal. "Am I fired now?" he asked. I had to tell him no, while wondering how we'd pay rent without my paycheck. The walls felt like they were closing in. Later that morning, Deborah called with better news. She'd worked out a deal with Geraldine Falk. If Tommy completed therapy twice a week and did 100 hours of community service at the library, his juvenile record would be sealed when he turned 18. I hated that my son needed a deal for exposing criminals, but Deborah reminded me that he did break into someone's house, and this was the best outcome we could hope for. She scheduled Tommy's first therapy appointment for Monday, and explained the community service would involve sorting books, which Tommy actually seemed excited about since he loved organizing things. That afternoon, Merrick called, saying his investigation had uncovered encrypted messages between Clancy and the two officers discussing the blackmail payments and how to split the money. But Clancy's lawyer was already challenging how the messages were obtained, claiming illegal surveillance. Merrick sounded frustrated, explaining that even with clear evidence of conspiracy, the legal system moved slowly, and technicalities could destroy cases, which made me wonder if Clancy would actually face real consequences after all. Saturday morning, we had to do Tommy's video deposition for the school district's insurance case. Watching him struggle with the formal questions made my chest hurt. The opposing lawyer kept asking the same things in different ways, and when Tommy got stressed, he started reciting facts about velociraptors, which the lawyer immediately pointed out as evidence of mental instability. Tommy couldn't understand why they kept asking about his feelings instead of facts, and started rocking in his chair, counting under his breath while I had to sit there, unable to help him. The lawyer asked if Tommy understood the difference between right and wrong, and Tommy, in his brutally honest way, said breaking into houses was wrong, but letting families get deported was worse, which, as you can imagine, didn't help our case at all. After 3 hours, they finally let us leave, and Tommy threw up in the parking lot from the stress while I rubbed his back and promised we'd get ice cream, even though my credit card was almost maxed out. My heart ached for him, for everything he was being put through. Sunday's paper had Sloan's first article about the scandal, focusing on how 3 of Clancy's biggest campaign donors had gotten exclusive contracts with the school district worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She'd found records showing these companies charged twice the normal rate for basic services, and the school board had approved every contract without question, which started making some people wonder what else Clancy had been hiding. The comments online were split between people calling for a full investigation and others saying Tommy was still a criminal who should be in juvenile detention, not walking free. It felt like we were living in 2 different realities. Monday brought more problems when our new alarm system went off at 2 a.m. with someone trying to break in through the back door. The siren scared them off, but the police found fresh footprints in the mud and tool marks on the door frame. Without cameras, though, they couldn't prove who it was. Tommy couldn't go back to sleep after that and spent the rest of the night organizing his dinosaur books by publication date, while I sat in the kitchen with a baseball bat, wondering if we'd ever feel safe again. We had to get out of this town. Tuesday, I started looking at apartments in other towns, but everything required first month, last month, and security deposit, which meant needing almost $4,000 I didn't have. I posted in a local parents group asking about cheap rentals, and within hours, someone had started a GoFundMe, saying families who believed in doing the right thing should help us get somewhere safe. By Wednesday, it had raised enough for a security deposit on a small place 2 towns over. Though reading the comments from people calling us heroes mixed with ones calling us criminals still made my head spin. The pre-trial hearing on Thursday went badly when the judge threw out half our evidence because of chain of custody issues with the documents Tommy had photographed at Clancy's house. Geraldine looked tired, explaining that without proper warrants, the photos might not be admissible, even though they clearly showed crimes being committed, which seemed insane to me. She said she was pivoting to focus on the financial crimes since Clancy never reported the blackmail money on his taxes, and had falsified school district reports to hide why certain families had suddenly left the district. These charges were harder for his lawyer to fight since the IRS didn't care how evidence was obtained as long as it proved tax evasion, which finally gave us some real, solid hope. Friday night, after Tommy finished his homework, I sat him down for a long talk about why breaking into someone's house was wrong, even when trying to help people. He kept saying the math didn't work out because one crime stopped bigger crimes. But I explained that we had to find legal ways to fight bad things, or we'd end up in jail, unable to help anyone. We made a new family rule, written on a poster board, that if Tommy saw something bad happening, he had to tell me first and we'd figure out the right way to handle it together. Tommy made me add an exception for if someone was currently being hurt, because he said waiting would make their pain his fault, which showed he understood even if his logic was different from most people's. It was a small but profound step forward. The next few weeks became a blur of legal meetings and paperwork that made my head spin. Monday morning, Deborah called, saying Clancy's deposition was scheduled for Wednesday, and she wanted me there for support, even though I couldn't speak. We sat in a conference room at some law firm downtown, while Clancy's lawyer tried to make everything sound innocent. But Deborah kept pushing with specific questions about the families. She showed him copies of texts he'd sent to parents mentioning IC and immigration status. Clancy's face got redder with each document she pulled out. After 2 hours of denying everything, he finally snapped and said he only mentioned ICE to maintain order in the school district. His lawyer immediately called for a break. But the damage was done. Deborah had gotten him to admit he threatened families, even if he claimed it wasn't blackmail. That Friday, I was pumping gas at the station near our apartment when a man I didn't recognize walked up to me. He started yelling about how I'd ruined a good man's life, and Tommy was a little criminal who belonged in jail. I grabbed my phone to call 911, my heart pounding, but then I saw Merrick Dunlap pulling into the station in his unmarked car. He must have been following this guy, because he immediately called for patrol units while keeping the man in sight. 2 police cars showed up within minutes and arrested him for violating the restraining order. Turns out he was Clancy's cousin from 2 towns over. The judge wasn't happy about the violation when we went back to court the following Tuesday. She added GPS monitoring to Clancy's bail conditions, plus a strict curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. He also couldn't have any contact with school families or interschool property. His lawyer argued it was excessive, but the judge said he'd brought it on himself by having associates harass us. Justice slowly was starting to show its face. Thursday was Tommy's juvenile court hearing, and I was so nervous I threw up twice that morning. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that buzzed. Tommy wore his only suit, which was already getting too small for him. The judge was an older woman who actually smiled at Tommy when he walked in. She'd read all the reports about his autism and the evidence he'd collected. Tommy had to answer questions about why he broke into Clancy's house, and he explained in his flat voice about Javier leaving and the other families who disappeared. The prosecutor wanted community service and mandatory therapy, but the judge went further and approved a full diversion program. Tommy would do therapy twice a week, and 100 hours of community service at the library, sorting and shelving books. If he completed everything, his record would be sealed. Tommy actually smiled when he heard about the library work. A genuine rare smile, since he loved organizing things. It was a victory, a hard-won peace for my son. Over the next month, the criminal cases against Clancy and the officers slowly worked through the system. Geraldine called me with updates, but warned me not to expect much jail time. The evidence was strong, but these were first offenses for men with long ties to the community. Clancy ended up pleading guilty to tax evasion and misdemeanor coercion in exchange for dropping the bigger charges. 2 years probation and $50,000 in fines, but no jail. It felt like a slap on the wrist. Williams pleaded to obstruction of justice and lost his pension, which at least hurt him financially. Nikolai's case got dropped completely due to insufficient evidence, since his involvement was mostly through relatives. It felt like such a letdown after everything they'd done, after all the fear and suffering. The school board meeting about Clancy's employment was packed with angry parents on both sides. Some defended him, saying he'd kept the school running smoothly for years. Others, empowered by Tommy's bravery, shared stories about friends who'd suddenly left town. After 3 hours of public comments, the board voted 4-3 to terminate his contract. Clancy's lawyer immediately filed an appeal, but at least he couldn't work in our district anymore. That was something. The civil suit dragged on for weeks with depositions and settlement conferences. Our homeowner's insurance finally agreed to pay Clancy the $15,000 for property damage, but I had to cover the $2,500 deductible in monthly payments. Deborah said it was unfair, but cheaper than going to trial where a jury might award him more. I signed the settlement papers, feeling sick about paying the man who'd hurt so many families. By this point, I knew we couldn't stay in town anymore. People recognized us at the grocery store and either thanked us or glared at us. Tommy couldn't understand why some kids called him a hero, and others called him a snitch. It was too much for him and for me. I found a 2-bedroom apartment 2 towns over that was smaller, but had a good school with an autism support program. The landlord didn't recognize our names, which felt like a blessing. We packed everything into a rented truck and left on a Sunday morning when the streets were empty, leaving behind the town that had both terrified and uplifted us. The new apartment had water stains on the ceiling and creaky floors, but it was ours and nobody there knew our story. I found remote data entry work that let me be home when Tommy got back from school. He started at his new school after winter break and came home the first day talking nonstop about the sensory room they had, with weighted blankets and noise machines. 3 months after that terrible night at the police station, I got a text from an unknown number. It was from Javier's mom, through a friend's phone, saying they were safe in Mexico, living with her sister. She thanked Tommy for trying to help and said Javier still talked about his friend who knew every dinosaur name. She said Javier kept the dinosaur book Tommy had given him for his birthday. I showed Tommy the message, and he asked if we could send more dinosaur books to Mexico. A week later, I drove 3 towns away to visit the auto shop where Aisha's dad worked. He looked older and tired, but his face lit up when I mentioned Tommy. He said his family was in Canada now and they couldn't come back, but they were safe. His eyes got wet when he talked about how Tommy was the only one at the school who noticed when Aisha stopped coming. He said Tommy had asked every teacher where she went, and wouldn't stop until someone gave him answers. That's when Tommy started collecting evidence, because he knew something bad was happening to his friends. Sloan sent me her draft article 3 weeks later, and she kept her promise about keeping us anonymous. She focused on how the school board had ignored warning signs for years, and how scared families had no safe way to report problems. The piece ran in the Sunday paper with a photo of the empty principal's office and quotes from families who finally felt safe enough to speak up. She interviewed experts about how schools could create better reporting systems and protect vulnerable families from exploitation. The article got picked up by bigger news outlets, and suddenly people were talking about policy changes instead of just our specific case. It felt like a small, quiet revolution. Merrick called me the day after the internal affairs report came out and asked me to meet him at a coffee shop 2 towns over. He showed me the new oversight policies they were putting in place for the police department. Officers would now have to report any knowledge of crimes involving school officials, and there would be quarterly reviews of complaint patterns. He admitted it wasn't enough to fix everything, but said more changes were coming that he couldn't talk about yet. His face looked tired but hopeful when he told me that 3 more officers had come forward about things they'd seen but been afraid to report. The remote data entry job I'd been doing wasn't paying enough, so I started applying everywhere for better positions. A company that did medical billing hired me to work from home with flexible hours that let me be there when Tommy needed me. The pay was better than my old job, and I didn't have to see anyone from town who still thought we were troublemakers. Money stayed tight with the insurance deductible payments, but we could finally afford Tommy's therapy twice a week without skipping meals. Tommy started his community service at the library, sorting return books and organizing the donation shelves. The elderly volunteers loved how careful he was with the old books, and how he remembered exactly where everything belonged. He even made friends with a retired teacher named Margaret, who brought him dinosaur magazines she found at garage sales. Every Saturday morning we'd drive to the library, and he'd work his 4 hours without complaining while I waited in the parking lot, doing my remote work on my laptop. His therapist said he was handling everything better than most adults would, and was developing healthy ways to process what happened. 6 months passed, and we settled into new routines that actually worked for both of us. Tommy learned to recognize when he was getting overwhelmed, and would ask for breaks before melting down. We practiced scenarios together, like what to do if he saw someone being hurt, or if someone asked him to keep a dangerous secret. He got better at explaining his feelings with words instead of just shutting down or acting out. I learned to give him space while still keeping him safe and stopped hovering so much. We made a binder with all our new family rules written out clearly so Tommy could check them whenever he needed. The list included 5 trusted adults he could go to with problems, including his therapist and Merrick, who'd stayed in touch. We programmed their numbers into his phone with photos, so he could call them directly if something was wrong. Every Sunday night we'd sit down, and he'd tell me anything that was bothering him from the week. He followed the rules better than I expected because we'd explained the reason for each one, and he understood they were to keep him safe, not just to control him. Sometimes I'd watch him at his new school and feel proud of how he tried to protect his friends. Even though his methods were completely wrong, we'd both learned hard lessons about how broken systems hurt people, and how standing up for others could have serious consequences. Tommy understood now that there were legal ways to help people, and that breaking into houses was never okay no matter what the reason. But I was still glad he had that instinct to protect others, even if we needed to channel it better. This morning was special because it was Tommy's first day taking the regular school bus instead of me driving him. 2 kids from his special education class were already at the stop, their backpacks covered in dinosaur patches. They ran up to Tommy, holding library books about prehistoric sea creatures, and started talking all at once about which ones were the coolest. Tommy actually smiled. Not his practice smile for photos, but a real one that reached his eyes. He looked back at me once before getting on the bus, and gave me a small wave that meant he was okay. The bus pulled away and I stood there for a minute, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not everything was fixed and probably never would be completely. But watching my son make friends who understood him, and seeing him happy about school again, made all the fighting worth it. The journey had been brutal, but we had found our way. Thanks for letting me wander along with you today. There's always more to think about, isn't there? See you around.